The year is 483 BC. The once mighty nation of Israel, home to God's chosen people, has been destroyed. The Jews, now a conquered people, desperately cling to their culture, language, heritage, sacred writings and religion. There are people dispersed across the Middle East, perhaps 2 million strong. We're going to glimpse into the lives of these scattered Jews today. A tiny remnant of Jews, perhaps 70,000, now live in Judea, having returned to the land of promise a few decades earlier after 70 years of Babylonian exile. They've rebuilt their sacred temple, but it's a feeble replica of Solomon's more opulent original building. These faithful Jews living in Judea eke out a living and cling to what is now, by geopolitical standards, an insignificant backwater region in a minor province of a massive new world superpower. This behemoth superpower is the great Medo-Persian Empire, the greatest kingdom the world has ever seen, ranging a colossal 7.5 million square kilometres of dominion. Its territory spanning 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Today, we're embarking on a study of the book of Esther, one of only 2 books of the Bible named after a woman. God is not mentioned once in this book. By contrast, the heathen king is mentioned by my count 247 times by name, title, or use of personal pronoun. Let me repeat that statistic for you just in case you missed it. God gets 0 mentions, the Gentile king 247 times. There's only 167 verses in the book of Esther. That makes 1.5 references to the king for every verse in Esther. This, I think, gives a very strong hint as to the political reason why the writer doesn't include the name of God. Prayer is not mentioned once in this book, yet the pagan cultural rituals are openly spoken about. The book is never referred to in any other book of the Bible, New Testament or Old. These details making the book of Esther somewhat enigmatic and peculiar. Many secular historians, hostile to the scriptures, doubt the historicity of this book. They are wrong. The accounts we're about to investigate are an accurate record of an important series of events in Jewish history. Events the Jews to this day remember annually in what they call the festival or feast of Purim. Let's read from verse 1 of chapter 1 of Esther. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Ahasuerus is the potentate of the Persian Empire. Ahasuerus is not actually his name, it's his title. The title means Lion King. There's more than one Ahasuerus mentioned in the Bible. The reputation of these rulers was implicit in their title. They were known for their lion-like ferocity and cruelty. History buffs will be more familiar with his name in Greek, which is Xerxes, who would become known as Xerxes the Great or Xerxes the First. He was the son of Darius the Great and the grandson of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus being the king who issued the decree for the Jews to return to the promised land and rebuild their temple. The Bible specifically details that Xerxes ruled over 127 provinces. Each of these provinces had local rulers or satraps who reigned in their region, but were subject to mighty King Xerxes. Verse 2, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel. Now this city, Shushan, is also known as SUSA, and for the rest of the book I'll use this simpler pronunciation. Verse 3, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, the princes of the provinces, being before him. when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendour of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. Newly crowned Xerxes assembles the rulers of each of his provinces. He wants to dazzle them, display his splendour and majesty. Xerxes puts on a 180-day feast, a massively expensive exercise. But truth be told, Xerxes has a secret agenda that's not mentioned in the Bible narrative. He has plans to expand his empire into Europe with a daring military campaign, to conquer the troublesome and dangerous lands of Greece to the west of his kingdom, a feat his father had failed to accomplish. And he wants his satraps and nobles on side with him when he lays out his plans. This sinister party's purpose was to convince his empire that he was capable of such a grand expedition. When these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days. For all the people were present in Susa, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. What's another 7 days feasting when you've just spent the last 6 months partying? And in this week-long feast, every man in Susa, great and small, was invited. After all, it's the average man who'll suffer most during Xerxes' invasion of Greece. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. Hopefully you've got the picture here. We're talking arguably the most outlandish, ostentatious, over-the-top party ever thrown. These finer details also suggesting the writer of this book was likely an eyewitness to these events. He's going out of his way to tell everyone how wonderful the king is. It's almost like he's trying to massage the king's ego. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. It's good to know the king has some standards. He wouldn't force people to drink against their wills. I think it's up to every believer to determine in your own conscience if it's right or not for you to drink. Personally, I never drink. That's my choice between me and God. It's a choice that can be a powerful witness. It can help you stand out as different, someone who doesn't just go along with the crowd, someone who holds themselves to higher standards. For a believer to choose not to drink, you can certainly avoid many hazards in life. I've observed when alcohol enters, intelligence usually exits. People often will drink habitually. I believe Christians should not be habitual drinkers. You have liberty in Christ to choose, but choose wisely, as bad choices have consequences. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. All the men were enjoying themselves. Why shouldn't the women, thought Vashti. This minor detail also hinting at a culture with a high degree of male-female segregation. Notice again the underlying grovelling in the royal palace, which belonged to the king. The writer of this account wants the king's approval. He doesn't want the bigger message redacted or banned. So right through the 10 chapters, the king is continually praised in a very over-the-top way. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded MEHUMAN, BIZTHA, HARBONA, BIGTHA, ABAGTHA, ZETHAR, and CARCAS. That last fellow was deadly. 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. By the end of the week, Xerxes was highly intoxicated. Part of the problem with alcohol is that it impedes sound judgment. The Bible commands believers to not be drunk with wine, which is dissipation, but be filled with the Holy Spirit. Christians most certainly should never get drunk. If you're a believer and you find that you're having struggles with alcohol, just give it up. Drunken Xerxes now wants to display his wife to his underlings in a lewd and culturally distasteful fashion. He wants to display her like a prized animal. This showing of the queen is totally culturally unacceptable, but the king is loaded with wine. But Queen Vashti refused to come to at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Vashti was understandably non-compliant. What am I? A hunk of flesh to be displayed for your boasting? Xerxes' anger is also somewhat understandable. He's just spent 6 months wining and dining the satraps and nobles of his empire, buttering them up for a military campaign. He needed them to be totally compliant. He needed yes men. And now his own queen was daring to publicly defy his commands. Vashti's refusal was mortifying to Xerxes and endangered his military plans and his standings in the eye of his nobles. Plus, since he became king, no one had ever dared say no to Xerxes. Just didn't happen. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote about Xerxes' very short fuse and terribly violent temper. According to Herodotus, when bad weather destroyed his pontoon bridge over a body of water, he ordered his men to whip the water 300 times as punishment. If this account is accurate, you really see the petulance of the king. Verse 12 would seem to be in keeping with this assessment, the described burning fury, which would become central to the latter part of this book. Verse 13, then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner towards all who knew law and justice, those closest to him, being Carshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? The first thing that jumps out at me is that Xerxes may be a king with incredible power, but he comes across as very indecisive. Do you really need people to tell you what to do in this instance, Xerxes? From this book, it seemed like Xerxes needed to be constantly advised on what he should do. He certainly does not come across as a very intelligent man. We also see that he had 7 eunuch advisors in verse 10, and now 7 princely advisors in verse 13. 7 is a critical number in the Bible. It speaks of completeness. It's a number that's relevant to both Jews and Christians, but it also seems it was an important number for the Persians. Verse 16, and Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. A complete overreaction and an exaggeration, of course. Every person in the world is wronged by the queen's righteous refusal. How silly. But when you see Xerxes' temper about to explode, the wisest thing to do is go with his indignation. And MEHUMAN seems to be the chief grovelling advisor. The queen's behaviour will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report. King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behaviour of the queen. Thus, there will be excessive contempt and wrath. It's really quite comical. The head of the Brains Trust starts to worry about a women's liberation movement thousands of years ago. Next thing you know, our wives will start to show contempt for us as well. You get the feeling that MEHUMAN's wife didn't hold him in high regard either. You can't legislate to stop people having excessive contempt for a fool. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out before him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his province, for it is great, a little more grovelling there for the king, all wives will honour their husbands, both great and small. An important cultural imperative is revealed in these events. As powerful as Xerxes was, once a royal decree was issued, it could not be altered or revoked. It also tells us we're now in the second kingdom of Daniel 2, the kingdom of the silver chest and arms. This king has diminished powers compared to the Babylonian head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar could say or command as he willed. He could overturn a previous law, no dramas. But this king is held to the law like anyone else. This fact will also become critical to how the book ultimately concludes. Verse 21, and the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of MEHUMAN. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people. This really demonstrates the small-mindedness of the king. It demonstrates a surprising lack of individuality and intelligence, and an inclination to overreact. From the evidence before us, I don't think that Xerxes is the sharpest tool in the shed. Not recorded in this biblical narrative. At the conclusion of chapter 1, Xerxes assembles a massive army and invades Greece in 480 BC. And we'll pick up in our next study commencing at chapter 2.